Okay, guys, let's move into Chapter 2 of Hilloock's book, which addresses problems of judgment. And here there are two really terrific activities that we'll discuss. In particular, we'll actually do a version of the second with the voluptuary. But the degree or the measure of how user-friendly are these lessons, both for students and teachers, is how many teachers in District 6 are, after a single professional development with Stacy, doing the mini mystery. So let's find you two more activities that you can incorporate into your classroom bag of tricks. Chapter 1 was all about working with facts, and facts are easy because they're indisputable. What we do with those facts might be at issue, but the facts themselves are pretty set. And as Hilloock indicates, starting with fact-based arguments allows you to introduce students to the skills that are fundamental to meaning-making, including identifying evidence or data and framing rules and warrants. However, our aim is to develop in students the ability to deal with more complex and complicated arguments, and that means they need to move from arguments of fact to arguments of judgment, where they have to do a little bit more interpretation. We are asking them to state reasons for the judgments they make. It's easier if you go back to the mystery because these are things that are irrefutable. The guy is lying on his back with a glass in his hand that's unbroken. Can't do anything with that. You can begin to make an argument for why that is suspicious, but the fact that that is the state in which he is found is indisputable. So we want students, as I say, to develop the ability to deal with more complex and complicated arguments. For any judgment we make, we have to validate that judgment by asserting the criteria we use to assess evidence and then applying that criteria to support our judgment. So the next step in Hilloock's mind, and I concur, is to work with simple, concrete problems that allow students to decide the criteria for making judgments. And that's the aim of the Mascot lesson Hilloock shares. And one of the reasons I like this lesson is because it is about students establishing criteria. Too often they make judgments and they can't explain the criteria by which they make those judgments. And that's the problem we're going to address with these kinds of activities. So let's look at the Mascot activity. And this is the mascot from Georgetown, where I was an undergraduate. And although the team is called the Hoyas, the mascot is the bulldog. And the problem is that a Hoya is a what? It's not a bulldog. It comes from the cheer in Latin that honored the football team's front four back when Georgetown was actually a football power sometime in the 1920s. When I was there in the 70s, Georgetown was neither a football nor a basketball power. And, by the way, I was actually the Georgetown mascot for some of the basketball games. I wore that bulldog costume. It was disgusting. Anyway, the cheer for the football team was Hoya Saxa, which means, what rocks? Saxa is rocks. So I guess a guy in a rock costume did not make for a great mascot, so they went with the bulldog. Anyway, the mascot lesson is pretty thorough, but there are a few things I want to point out to you. And for those of you familiar with lesson planning, this might be repetitive. But for those of you who are less familiar, this is a nice reminder. Note how Hilloock starts with a story about his high school mascot. There's the hook. This is the way you get a kid interested in what you are about to do. Your students are interested in you, so talking about you, always a good thing. Then he asks students about their mascot, and here's another opportunity to practice the 5 W's and H. It is a tool for you, right? It's a tool for you for asking questions. When you want to gather information from your students, and when you want them to be able to think through ideas about the topic, 5 W's and H should be your go-to tool for anything. Anyway, the students' answers to the questions you pose offer you a sense of their prior knowledge. And it's important to know what they know for multiple reasons. Among them, it indicates what you do and do not need to teach. Now, I happen to hate the KWL chart. I hate it because it's formulaic, and students look and they see a teacher write K, they write W, they write L, and they go, oh great, we're doing a KWL chart. You don't need to use a KWL chart, you just need to ask questions. So the theory behind the activity is solid. We want to build on what students know. The practice of putting a K on the board, all of a sudden they roll their eyes. Now, notice how the criteria for the mascot are set by the students. They establish criteria, then they create a rule or warrant based on that criteria, and they use a template. As a rule, a mascot should be. As a rule is the STEM starter, and you know I love the STEM starter. It's such a terrific tool for students at all levels of ability. Now, Hilloock will use a model later in the lesson too, when he has the teacher think aloud on page 48, the paragraph about the bobcat. If you look at that paragraph, you should be able to locate and label the concrete detail and the warrant. And in sending students to craft their own argument of judgment, they are advised to, quote, use the paragraph the class just composed together as a model. So there's a couple of things going on here that are important. Establishing criteria. Too often, as I said before, students make judgment and they can't articulate what the criteria for their judgment are. Criterion is single, criteria is plural. And if you think about it, ESPN will do, who's the greatest basketball player, Kobe, Michael, or Magic? And then they have this whole debate. Well, what's the criteria? And that's an important lesson. I get frustrated by that because how we judge something depends on what the criteria are we established for either excellence, for failure, for success. And criteria are the hardest part to frame. That's the most personal part. The applying of it is easy, but establishing it is the complex and complicated act. When we talk about arguments that are more complex and complicated, we are really talking about the warrant. So let's look at the warrant from the lesson. As a rule, a mascot should be something students can take pride in which they can take pride. And let's see how we work this in the claim data warrant argument, right? So I would make a claim. A rock is a stupid mascot, right? So I say, why? Well, rocks are inanimate and they don't do anything. So, as a rule, a mascot should be something students can take pride in. A rock does not inspire pride. Therefore, choosing it as a mascot is unwise to inspire students, right? Now, I'm going to be a little proleptic here and talk about backing. Who says a rock does not inspire pride? Somebody might say to me, I don't agree with that. So I might even need to say more, which is a rock is a piece of hard dirt, and dirt is never really considered inspirational. If the rock were a diamond, it might be inspirational. Do you see what I'm saying? Just because you have warrant doesn't mean your argument is necessarily done. And so that's the next level that we'll be applying, the idea of backing. So I wanted to throw that in there because you'll remember we talked about that. There was that visual, that graphic about claim data warrant and then backing of the Toolman thing, and I told you I couldn't understand what it said. But what I do understand about backing and what we need to understand about backing is sometimes there are assertions we make in our warrant that need a little bit more support. So anyway, Hilloock's lesson has students identify the multiple criteria and then they state those as warrants and then they apply the criteria. So one example of a criterion is aspiring pride. Another criterion might be it has to be a cool costume. Okay. This process is invaluable. Let me say it again. Because any time one argues a point, and remember, thesis is an argument, the key will be the criteria one establishes for a reasonable or viable answer or response. Sort of what goes in the because clause. Finally, what I love about all the lessons Hilloock shares is that he is relentless in adhering to the model that you will be singing in your sleep. Show them, do it with them, let them practice in groups, and only then send them off to practice independently. So what we've got is Hilloock's incremental approach, baby steps, from an argument based on fact, and for him, irrefutable fact, that leads to a conclusion, he moves to simple arguments of judgment. We start with the who in your judgment done it, right? The murder mystery. We move to what should we choose based on criteria, in this case, what mascot? Applying criteria, invaluable skill. And for the mascot, not only do the students decide the criteria, they use it to select a mascot, answering which in your judgment best fits the criteria. In the voluptuary activity, the students are asked to make a judgment based on the evidence supplied by the artist. Here they move to a more interpretive assignment. And on Thursday, we're going to do something similar to this using posters. And we'll conflate Hilloock's activity for arguments of judgment with one that is a bit more interpretive and involves the issue of propaganda, which is a key topic that is addressed in secondary classrooms. So it'll sort of do double duty. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about the lessons that Hilloock depicts in this chapter, both the mascot and the voluptuary. I love that word. First, This chapter is a lesson in differentiation, right? Differentiation involves understanding that the same content must be taught to students who are at different levels of ability. In this chapter, he kind of does this. The repulsive Prince of Wales activity is an example of a more advanced version of the Mascot Activity, right? And the Mascot Activity is the next level of instruction in a curriculum that begins with the fact-based murder. So we're gradually progressing, as I said before, making baby steps. The Mascot and the voluptuary are very similar. They truly are a more sophisticated version, the voluptuary, of the Mascot Activity. And in that way, the two of them are different from the fact-based murder mystery. So you could give some struggling students the Mascot and some more adept literacy learners the voluptuary or the picture, whatever, we'll do the poster one, in the same classroom, because they are doing a lot of the same activities, just higher order for one group and a little bit more straightforward for the second group. So this is an example. Or you might do the Mascot Activity with the whole class. Some students get it, some not. So you move those who do get it onto the voluptuary, and then you come up with another criteria-based assignment for those who are struggling, and they do something similar to Mascot assignment again until they're ready to move on to the next level of instruction. So that's something I like about this. But also the idea of progressing in baby steps, as I call it, or increments, is truly the way to ensure mastery and learning. There are a few other elements in this lesson that I want to point out because they reflect the kinds of things I want you to make part of your teaching. And as you continue in this text, and as you plan your lessons for our class, and as you observe if you're in a classroom this semester, I want you to watch and to see what kinds of examples of these tangential but important elements of teaching you practice or you observe in your classrooms. So for example, one is the Hoosier Rule. The Hoosier Rule is at play in the recounting of the voluptuary lesson. Note how the teacher uses questioning techniques, right? This is not a kind of bang-bang Q&A. What we see is the teacher asking a question and soliciting multiple responses. She asks follow-up and clarifying questions. She encourages responses by asking students if they agree or disagree with their peers, or if they have anything to add. When there are multiple students who want to answer, she eliminates the ooh-ooh hands in the air by saying first Bill, then Mary, then John. Anyway, I call this a version of the Hoosier Rule, which is 4 students talk before the conversation comes back to you. The next thing I want to point out is vocabulary and context. In all the lessons we've seen so far, you'll note that when a word comes up that the teacher thinks it might be unfamiliar, he or she pauses to introduce new vocabulary. And there's an art to interrupting instruction to teach new words or some other content. So the explanation about venereal disease or the puking pot in the portrait, that information is essential to the task. Or look again at page 64 when the teacher discusses 18th century political theory and the idea of the coup d'etat. Yeah, there are times when you must provide direct expository instruction. That's fine. Just know when it best fits into the progress of the lesson. So that's a key thing I want you to attend to. Likewise, when there is an opportunity to teach new terms or new words, do it. Look again at how the words distributive justice and equity are addressed by the teacher, and that's on page 55, right? That, these are opportunities to introduce vocabulary in context, to have students copy vocabulary into the section of their notebook. Gallagher talks about setting up such a notebook when he takes class time to divide it into sections that make it easy for students to access, and the notebooks become a learning tool, not just a bullshit place where students write random stuff they never look at again. Also note how the teacher makes the students repeat back their assignments to make sure they understand what they're doing, right? She says, write this down. And then she says, somebody tell me what we just said. And finally, yeah, we're teaching argument and writing and all the other content requirements of ELA, but we're also teaching more abstract content, how to be a good person, how to be kind and fair and generous. And the teacher in this classroom pauses instruction after a student calls another stupid. Actually, he calls the idea stupid, which is better but still problematic, right? But she pauses to talk about respect, not about the lesson at all. She steps out of the lesson to talk about something bigger, and that is how I hope you teach. Yes, it does slow the lesson down, and yes, it takes them a few minutes to get back into things after this short but kind of uncomfortable moment. Too bad. It's worth the few moments of awkwardness, and your job is to move them back into the lesson.